I love this short clip from Bird Box, in part because it's just so humorous, but it speaks to a reality. And it's an old clip, and I went back and looked at some of the comment section from years ago, and one really stood out at me, and it made this statement that, the point of the clip is really that only a fool gets down on the level to make themselves a fool for other people. And that we shouldn't get bogged down with doing ridiculous things that might put ourselves in danger or in harm just to prove a point or just to be right. But I went back and I rewatched the video over and over and over again, and I realized that the first animal is more concerned about saving the other than they are about their own safety. And there's something phenomenally beautiful within all of that. Our scripture passages for this morning, both from Isaiah and from Matthew, they talk about this voice in the wilderness of what it means to be prophetic. And prophecy has a real interesting way of working its way out in our denominations and our religions nowadays, but really to be a prophet in the Old Testament just meant that you were willing to stand outside of the religious systems and the political systems of the day and to point out where the hypocrisy or the injustice existed. And so we come to these passages today with that in mind. I can't help but think back to when I was in seminary. My wife is a registered nurse, and she would have to work either Christmas Eve or Christmas Day. And I remember I would go pick her up from the hospital on Christmas morning, and we would drive down to go see our family. And I remember one Christmas I was pretty angry and just bitter about the fact that I had to go and she had to work, and that we were missing out on having a family Christmas Eve. It was right after our oldest, my son, was born, and I felt just that sense of frustration. And I drove up to the hospital, and I remember as I drove up, I looked into the windows on the 3rd and 4th and 5th floor, and I thought about the patients that were inside. I thought about the people who didn't want to be there on Christmas. And all of a sudden, this sense of pride began to well up in me, this pride, the fact that my wife was willing to sacrifice her time and her energy and her Christmas Eve to be able to be there for people when they really needed it. The Apostle John lived out in the wilderness, and he ate locusts and honey, and he fashioned his clothes from the skin of animals, and it seemed really foolish that he did it because he felt that there was a greater cause, a greater thing at work, a greater call on his life to do something that was more than just regular or ordinary. And there are people all around us that do the same thing today. In 1910, Theodore Roosevelt, giving a speech called Citizenship in a Republic in France, was quoted with saying these words: "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out where the strong one stumbled or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the one who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who actually strives to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends themselves in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if fails, at least they failed while daring greatly, so that their place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who knew neither victory nor defeat." It's hard to be the voice in the wilderness. It's hard to be the one that does seemingly the foolish act of jumping onto the crocodile and risking their own self to save others. But this is the time of the year when we really reflect on that and what that means and what that is. We're reminded as we come closer and closer to Easter of the beautiful statements, the meaningful act of sacrificing oneself for others. And all around us, in cities and states and countries all around this world, we're seeing that. One of my friends lives up in New York, and I asked him this week how he was doing, and he said, we're trying to treat this as much like a staycation for our kids and hold on to that feeling for as long as possible. And we're kind of just trying to not watch the news, because it seems like the news is just filled with more and more anxiety and dread and concern and worry, and probably rightfully so, but that at some point you just kind of have to turn it off and not listen to it, because of how much it seems to impact us and our family, of how much it seems like this wilderness, deserts, where nothing good could possibly spring forth. I think that it can certainly feel like we're living in a bit of a wilderness. We're living in the middle of some strange foreign land that we've never understood or known or seen before, and it looks kind of familiar because it's the world that we have grown accustomed to, but it also looks very different because it doesn't look like the world that we're accustomed to. And in the middle of that wilderness, I really do genuinely believe that God is calling people to act and speak and live in very different ways. It's amazing to me when I think about the world that we're living in now. I went grocery shopping this week for the first time in about a week and a half. And I remember the last time I went grocery shopping, it seemed a little different. There was a long line of people waiting outside. And just the protocols and everything that you had to do seemed different. And then when I went this week, it just seemed so much worse, so much more significant, so much more serious. And I thought about all those people, the grocery store workers and the clerks, the truck drivers and the hospital workers, the people who are putting themselves out on the front line in the middle of all of this to make sure that everything still runs and goes normally. I thought about our healthcare professionals that are going into difficult and trying areas. And I think that it's easy to look at them or the work that they do and to think of it sometimes as foolish. And maybe it is. But time and time again in history, when it has mattered most, people have done seemingly foolish things because it is what was needed. It's foolish to strap on a uniform and go into a war zone. It's foolish to get on firefighter equipment and run into a collapsing building that you know there's no way out of. It's foolish to go into a hospital room with patients without proper PPE or face guards. But time and time and time again, people all over this country, people all over this world engage in that work because it is right and it is good and it is meaningful. Another picture came across my Facebook feed this week, and it was this one of a bluebonnet trying to grow out of a bed of rocks. And it was a beautiful depiction, I think, of exactly what this passage means. That we could spring up in the middle of seemingly unexpected places of dread and anxiety, of fear and discomfort, and that in the middle of it, that something beautiful can bloom. That we could be the messages of hope and love, of peace and joy, of forgiveness and grace that permeate through this seemingly dreadful time. That we could be the voice of the wilderness, giving declaration to something better, something greater, giving an acknowledgement to the fact that at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the month, at the end of the year, that we would come through this and will look a lot different than it does now. And there will be numerous people who sacrifice greatly for it. But that we would declare that their work is not in vain. That our struggle is not in vain. And that the promises that we celebrate at this time of the year of resurrection and new life and new beginnings will spring forth. They will come through. To that God, to the God who reminds us each and every day of the power of grace and love, of the power of life that seemingly finds a way to continue to push through. To that God of life be all honor, glory, dominion, and power now and forevermore. Amen.